Every story needs a hero, and every story needs a villain.
One should strive to act with compassion and empathy towards all creatures in accordance with reason. The struggle for justice is an ongoing and necessary pursuit that should prevail over laws and institutions. One's body is inviolable, subject to one's own will alone. The freedoms of others should be respected, including the freedom to offend. To willfully and unjustly encroach upon the freedoms of another is to forego one's own. Beliefs should conform to one's best scientific understanding of the world. One should take care never to distort scientific facts to fit one's beliefs. People are fallible. If one makes a mistake, one should do one's best to rectify it and resolve any harm that might have been caused. Every tenet is a guiding principle designed to inspire nobility in action and thought. The spirit of compassion, wisdom, and justice should always prevail over the written or spoken word. Those sound like logical ways to think and live, correct? It sounds like there's a lot of common sense in those 7 paragraphs that I just read. You might be saying to yourself, I probably follow a lot of those. Well, you're probably also asking, what was I reading? Simply put, I was reading the 7 fundamental tenets of the Satanic Temple. Now, the Satanic Temple has been in the news a lot lately as they are fighting for the freedom of choice down in the state of Texas. You can pretty much do a Google search on any of this right now, and you're going to see the Satanic Temple pop up. Now, when I say that word, Satanic Temple, there's a really good chance that many of you automatically associate that with what you've seen in horror movies and what you believe are Satan worshipers. No, we are not sitting at a wooden stump altar in the forest right now, sacrificing virgins with a goat and Satan rising from the flames. It's none of that. All right. It's the idea of going against the grain. It's the idea of engaging in a community of people that believe thought, intelligence, compassion, logic, common sense is the way to be in 2021. And there's many of us out there. I've been a card-carrying member of the Satanic Temple for a while. Is it a metal thing to do? Sure. But after reading those 7 fundamental tenets to you, and you shaking your head and agreeing that, yeah, they're logical, then you can see why so many people have joined the community of the TST. It also gave you a chance, once I explained where those tenets came from, for you to challenge yourself with your judgment or your curiosity. For my friends that know me, know that I'm not out in the woods sacrificing babies to Satan. All right. I have a job. I have a car. I love my mom. I have a cat. My friends are awesome. I love to laugh. I'm just like many of you out there. So what I believe doesn't really matter if I'm not out there harming others or trying to harm others, right? And like I said, there's many of us out there that are doing good that are also associated with the TST. In fact, our guest today is proudly a TST member. He's doing some amazing work in the realm of mental health. He's an associate professor of clinical psychology and the co-director of sexuality studies at Minnesota State University. He's also a licensed clinical psychologist, certified sex therapist affiliated with Minnesota Sexual Health. His name is Dr. Eric Sprankle, and he is our guest today. And without further ado, we're going to get right to the interview where we cover a variety of topics, including the ones that I opened the show with and many other that are related towards this show's realm of talking about sexual shame, shadow work, subculture, and all those wonderful things near and dear to us. So without further ado, here is the interview between myself and Dr. Eric Sprankle. Based on what I've been able to follow with you on social media and everything that you post and looking into some of your work, where did you first get your passion, not only for psychology, but sexual psychology? Where did that first start in your path and to where you're at now?
Yeah, so I actually entered college as a criminal justice major. I was more interested in like homicide investigations, whether that was going to be working with a local police department or FBI, something like that. But that was always an interest from like childhood, and that stuck until my freshman year in college. But only a couple of weeks into that first semester, I was taking a Psych 101 class. It's just kind of a gen ed. And that just started piquing my interest a lot more in terms of like career aspects or prospects rather, and what I could do within the psychology field as opposed to the criminal justice field. At that time, though, I just combined the two. So I was originally interested in forensic psychology. And so a psychologist role, still working within the criminal justice system, doing competency evaluations for defendants, things like that. But it was my second year in college at the University of Cincinnati. This would have been around 2002, I believe, so almost 20 years ago. I took just a psychology of human sexuality class, and that was just extremely fascinating. Everything that I thought I knew about sex was either just flat out wrong or some type of myth shrouded in like a scare tactic kind of gained through either like poor K through 12 sex ed or just kind of, myths that we hear about kind of growing up from peers. And so I was just fascinating like that could be a career trajectory within psychology. And at that time, I was interested more in like sex therapy and pursuing becoming a clinical psychologist specializing in sexuality and applied practice. It wasn't until about 10 years ago that I wanted to focus more on academia than applied practice. But yeah, it's been about 20 years now, and really started with a college level class.
So I want to piggyback off something you said there, because this is one of those parts that fascinates me. So I've had a couple guests on before from various walks of life. We've talked about the sex education system in America. Education system, of course, not that great to begin with. So you look at sex education, of course, it's very not up to snuff, shall we say. So what were some of those things that kind of blew your mind about when you started really digging into this, going, whoa, I was taught all this stuff that was horribly wrong, that you decided to really kind of dig into so you could bring the truth to more people?
Yeah, I think one thing looking back that really stuck was just the normalization of masturbation. Growing up, you didn't hear that, or from my experience, you didn't hear that in any type of formal sex ed. And formal sex ed for me was, a gender segregated lecture about puberty in 5th grade, and then an STI lecture in 8th grade, and then a little bit more of an STI lecture in a health class, maybe like 10th or 11th grade in high school. And that was it. Nothing was talked about, pleasure or masturbation. And so we were just kind of left with figuring out, is this normal? Is this healthy? Is this okay? How much is too much? And of course, you hear like the old wives' tales and myths about like hairy palms and going blind. And you can like dismiss that. And that's kind of easy. But like you still start questioning, like, well, where did those like scare tactics come from? Maybe there is some truth. Maybe I won't get like hairy palms or go blind, but this can't be like healthy like all the time. And it wasn't until that class where it was instructed to me by a professional, a sex educator, a clinical psychologist, saying unequivocally that masturbation is healthy. And that was like just mind blowing and eye opening. And it's like, well, I want to be a disciple of this moving forward, from Dr. Hatfield's work, and do this for myself and in my own career, and kind of continue this message of really just kind of debunking basic myths that we still have about sexuality. And that's the funny thing, because I teach college level courses on human sexuality, both lower level courses at like the 200 level, and then advanced 400 and graduate level classes. And a lot of the focus of the class, unfortunately, is providing students with information that they should have received in fifth grade or earlier. This is a college level class. I eventually get to some more advanced topics, but to have to start with like essentially learning the ABCs for these college level students is pretty ridiculous, but it's no fault of theirs. It's the system that we live in, and we're not getting this information.
And one of my friends likened it to the amount of sex ed is that the amount that they actually teach high school students to, have good finances and balanced checkbooks. It's like it's non-existent.
Right.
So everybody's left kind of guessing or relying on media, movies, TV, which we know is the most accurate thing in the world. But I know recently, due to one of your posts, I saw you were looking into starting a new project, a book, I believe you said, on the topic of masturbation. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this really originated just from some comments I've gotten on very simple posts, either on Twitter or Instagram, that essentially just says like masturbation is healthy or something along those lines, and people coming out of the woodwork kind of trying to debate that or like flat out like disagree with it, even though I'm saying like, no, you're wrong. This is actually what the science says about masturbation, and they're still not buying it. They think it's just a matter of opinion. Or those who are just kind of ignorant for the reasons that we just talked about and still hold on to a lot of myths. And so just kind of the questions that they're asking about like, well, what if I do it daily? Or what if I'm doing it to kind of cope with stress? And so all these questions we're still kind of left with all this ignorance that we have about masturbation. I felt kind of compelled to really write a book on just cutting through all that bullshit and just looking at, okay, this is what the science says about masturbation and all different topic areas, starting with like in utero masturbation, which is documented in ultrasound imaging, all the way through older adult masturbation to, hospice care and palliative care. Our last kind of dying wishes is to experience pleasure for some. And then how to incorporate masturbation into that. So it's very kind of developmental lifespan kind of approach to understanding the science of masturbation, and really just kind of cutting through all the myths and misinformation that still is out there.
And so fair to say that in your findings, you probably found the history of, shame as associated with people masturbating as a tie to like their sexual shame from their past. So we've talked about, the sexual shame on this podcast several times, because the podcast is very rooted in Jung's shadow work, because a lot of shame, shadow work's kind of tied in together. So big question here, in your professional opinion, biggest contributor to one's sexual shame?
I'll say broadly it's sexual ignorance, but then looking at where that ignorance comes from, we talked about the poor or lack of K through 12 comprehensive sex ed. And all these things are not mutually exclusive, they're interrelated. So you have the poor or lack of comprehensive sex ed, K through 12. You also have what's kind of called silent parents or silent families. These are households in which most of us grow up in. It's actually pretty rare to grow up in a household where someone is being, parents are being very punitive toward their children on the topic of sex and saying like, this is wrong, this is a sin. There's certainly individuals who get that harmful message. But for most of us, our parents just don't say anything at all. It's this taboo that's completely avoided, and that's a message in and of itself. And unfortunately, it's still a negative message, because now sex is shrouded in taboo and mystery. We often wonder, well, why aren't we talking about this openly? I can't bring it up because it hasn't been brought up before. And so we grow up in these silent families where we don't get any information from parents. And then also religion as a contributing factor, religious prohibitions against sexuality that deviate from permissible sex, which is a very, very narrow definition of what sex is. And that's fine. That works for some people, but it's not a universal truth of what is healthy sexuality as defined by religious leaders. And so when that is kind of the cultural norm of a religious leader's definition of what is healthy sex or permissible sex, when most of us are going to deviate from that, or at least want to deviate, that's where we can start having some shame and guilt and embarrassment tied in, because we're now viewing ourselves as essentially deviants.
with clients you have worked with where sexual shame was a topic, was religion kind of like a reoccurring theme that would be a part of someone's life, along with misinformation, no information? And how did you help them kind of navigate through that, through that upbringing that's kind of been really hardwired into them?
Right. So for the patients that I've had in the past where it has been like explicitly rooted in some type of religious shame, kind of growing up, first you need to explore whether or not they still adhere to those same values that their parents grew up in, or forced them to grow up in within whatever religious belief system it was. More than likely, they don't. They have deviated a little bit from the teachings of whatever religion that they were exposed to in their childhood, but they're kind of left with these remnants of sex still means X, Y, or Z. Right. And so when that happens, you can kind of look at this dissonance that exists, or this incongruence between their values, either current values and behavior, or at least past values and behaviors, and have them, at least give them the permission to start restructuring what does their religion look like for them now? What do they want it to look like for them now, if that's anything at all, right? A lot of times these individuals, their value system, their beliefs rather, are atheistic. And so then it's just aligning, well, what are your values then as an atheist? If it's not going to be grounded in whatever, typically from my personal experience working with patients, a Christian background, if your values and morals and beliefs are no longer grounded in this Christian upbringing, so what is it grounded in now? How do you define what is moral, or what do you value in life? And that's your code then, and your code can then be congruent with your behavior. So a lot of it is permission granting to essentially be an apostate, if that's the direction that they're going, and that's okay, right? If something's no longer fitting with them religious wise, helping them to explore something that does fit better with them, whether that's another religion that's a little bit more in line with their behavior and their values and their identities, or if that's no religion at all. But the big thing here is that it's all guided by the client. It's unethical for a therapist to like route the direction for them of like, here, you need to be over here as in this new religion, or you need to become an atheist. That's just as unethical as a therapist taking an atheist client and saying that you need to be Christian in order to be healthy and happy.
Right. It's like presenting new forks in the road. Like, you don't just have this one road. Here's several. Here are the options. Here's why those options might work, and then letting them kind of ultimately make that choice.
Right.
I mean, that's something I've learned recently in life coaching, since we're like, we don't give the answers. We just ask the questions and guide them through there. But that makes complete sense. Somebody, I think if you grow up with, like I thankfully didn't grow up in a very religiously repressed household. It was very kind of open, find your own truths the older I got, but seen many of my friends growing up that were suppressed. I'm like, well, you're now 25 doing things that don't fit how you grew up. Like, why would you keep associating with this just out of habit when it no longer fits the narrative of your world?
And a problem with that too, and what makes it more challenging to distance oneself from these childhood beliefs, is the community and support system that's built into that. Right. And the more insulated a belief system is, and this is very true for like evangelical cultures, in which they go to evangelical schools, their whole like upbringing and identity is surrounded within this evangelical community. And so if they start distancing themselves from that, they're losing friends, they're having strained relationships with family members, and now they feel like very isolated and socially withdrawn, right? And so not only is it managing those conflicts that can arise in those relationships that are now strained, and kind of removing oneself from some of those relationships, trying to set better boundaries with other relationships that you may want to hang on to, maybe like with family, but then also seeking out new relationships that are part of your new community. And so you're not isolated, you're not alone. There are others who share these new values with you.
Right. It's definitely just a part of just getting older, is just understanding your communities will change as you change. And a lot of people kind of cling to, almost, I don't call them dead friendships, but friendships that no longer kind of fit where they're at now. So yeah, no, I get that. I completely get that. So I wanted to kind of switch topics a little bit here, because a lot of my friends, I'm sure you have quite a few friends as well in the sex work industry, you're a very big supporter of their rights, from all I've seen online. Do you think there's a correlation, and I'm always been curious about this, between sexual shame and the opponents of sex workers and their rights to like earn a living?
Yeah, I'm not aware of research that has explicitly looked at that connection, but if I were to design a study to test that, that would certainly be my hypothesis, is that sexual shame is certainly an influential factor in opposition of sex workers' rights. And that's obvious in like those who are more conservatively religious and have opposition to the sex workers' rights movement. That's certainly rooted in kind of like their own understanding of what sex should be and shouldn't be, and when sex is something that it in their mind something that it shouldn't be, that brings up a lot of shame and guilt. But even those who aren't religious, or at least overtly religious, oftentimes their arguments, the opposition's arguments, do kind of fall into just like essentially having icky feelings about sex. And this really gets exposed when you start seeing some of their double standards, right? So even if they're taking more of a feminist argument against sex work, and there's certainly feminist arguments in favor of sex workers' rights, but there are some feminist arguments that are in opposition to sex workers' rights. But that really kind of brings up some double standards about what should women be allowed or not allowed to do, how should they, quote, use their body. It's a lot of the same opposition to like BDSM, saying there's no woman who would actually consent to these kinds of behaviors, whether it is BDSM behaviors or engage in sex work consensually. They are just succumbing to patriarchal messaging. And then there's also, even from like labor rights perspectives, of being opposed to sex workers' rights, for some reason not viewing sex workers as part of the labor rights movement. Some of their opposition really comes down to also just viewing sex as something that's inherently different, and something that, and a lot of times they get into more of a romantic view of sex, that it's something special, that it should be saved for someone, that you actually have loving feelings for, where there's emotions. It can't just be this exchange, this financial exchange. And that's really just kind of a projection of personal beliefs about what sex should be. And those people shouldn't engage in sex where it is just transactional, or it's lacking in some other type of meaning for them, because that would be incongruent with their values. But to think that everybody shares those values is definitely way off from reality. And I would say the root is kind of still rooted in the sexual shame of thinking that sexuality is something different. It needs to be like protected in some way.
So this will be kind of like a spur of the moment off, kind of with the topic and related, but from past conversations I've had with people that view sex as wrong when it's not in a marriage, and their views basically kind of got fed to them, either whether from upbringing or we'll say their exposure to certain kinds of pornography, where they instantly go like, oh, well, that's not love, that's not passionate, can't do that. Do you feel porn plays a positive or negative influence in society nowadays, or is it just really up to the person who's watching it?
Yeah, it's definitely more on the person who's watching it. Porn in and of itself is neutral. The reason, and historically, researchers have viewed it not so. They viewed it as this entity that is going to inherently cause like some type of typically harm. But then kind of like when the pendulum swung the other way, it's saying like porn is great, it's good, everyone should watch it. It's like, well, that's just as not grounded in reality as kind of like the opposition of like the anti-porn. So taking more of a porn neutral stance, it's less about porn itself or the porn content, and much more about who is watching it, and that unique interaction of the consumer and the content that they are watching. Porn can certainly be a big positive influence in a person's life and a relationship, but it also can be pretty detrimental, especially in what the modern research over the past 10 years has shown. It's pretty detrimental if you have negative negative beliefs about porn, and it goes against your values, but you still watch it. We can think, obviously, that's going to create some distress. But what we've seen is like that's the largest ingredient, or the most important or powerful ingredient in determining if someone is labeling themselves as like a porn addict, or if it's causing problems in the relationship. Again, it's not the porn itself, it's one's own values about porn and whether or not porn exists within that value system or not.
You mentioned the word, is somebody a porn addict? The big hot topic out there, I've seen several discussion groups about is if sex addiction is a thing or not. Do you believe that sex addiction is real, or is it just kind of another way to kind of condemn those that ultimately enjoy it freely?
It can be both. The term addiction is not even a really precise clinical term. So I think a lot of times we get caught up in the semantics of it. It's like, no, sex addiction, that actual term, it's not a clinical diagnosis. The word addiction is not even in the DSM-5. If anything related to like substance use, it's substance use disorder. It's not a chemical addiction or anything like that. So we can get like into the semantic arguments about like sex addiction is not real because it's not an actual diagnosis. But if we kind of broaden that out and just kind of think, can sex become a problem for somebody? Absolutely, it can, right? It'll be difficult to find somebody who would disagree with that assertion. So now the argument is just what is causing that problem and what's the best way to treat it. What have people been so critical about, like the whole sex addiction kind of conceptualization of problematic sexual behavior, is that the treatment for those who have been labeled a sex addict has largely followed kind of like this 12-step model that really kind of focuses on abstinence and really kind of makes a lot of assumptions about what healthy sexuality is or should be and what it should look like. And that really doesn't provide much room for masturbation, BDSM, sex work, things that are typically considered like deviant because it goes against somebody's definition of what is permissible sex. And for a clinical model to kind of fit into that more like moralistic model just opens up a whole host of problems. So from more of a clinical perspective, kind of what I was alluding to earlier, like those who consider themselves to be sex addicts, that is predicted on this what's called moral incongruence, that they have a value system about sex in which their behaviors are not living up to those values. And so if they think that sex should only be between a man and a woman in marriage, but they're having sex and they're not married, they're having sex with same-gendered individuals, then they're going to feel distressed by that. And they're going to feel, quote unquote, out of control because they can't control their urges to engage in sex that's outside of their value system. And so that feeling, that subjective feeling of being out of control is what's being labeled as addiction. So that exists. But the treatment is not, oh, you need to now stay away from premarital sex. It's like, okay, well, let's look at what is your value system? What are your current behaviors? There's obviously a disagreement between the two. How can we make these two entities a little bit more aligned? Does that mean changing your sexuality a little bit? Or does that mean changing your values a little bit?
America's ED problem of how it affects like usually about 1 in 5 men, knowing that I have a fitness background and whatnot. So I deal with this a little bit, knowing that physical issues can always come up. But as far as psychological issues that are tied to ED, what do you think, what are some of those reasons that you found that bring about the ED problem in America with men?
Sure. So ED can be secondary to a lot of other conditions, either other mental disorders like anxiety or depression, or secondary to the physical conditions or substances, whether they're illicit substances or prescriptions or whatever. So it can be secondary to something else. If it's primary erectile dysfunction or erectile disorder, generally that just falls under the umbrella of, quote unquote, the performance anxiety. So they don't necessarily have an anxiety disorder per se, like this more generalized, but there's a lot of anxiety about having sex with somebody. That performance demand of like, am I going to get an erection? How long am I going to be able to last? You know, will they like me? What do they think about my body? So all these things, right? And if we're feeling anxious, what that's doing on a physical level is that's constricting our blood vessels, and that's actually kind of making getting an erection difficult because we need relaxed blood vessels for that. So it can be not simple, but a simple explanation of performance anxiety. What I saw, like I don't do clinical work now, since I've been a professor since 2011. I returned to clinical work briefly when I was on a sabbatical to rejoin clinical practice a couple of years ago. And all of my patients were men, and I would say about 80 to 90% of them had some type of erectile functioning complaint. Only one actually met diagnostic criteria for erectile disorder. The others, they just weren't experiencing the erectile difficulties for long enough or consistent enough. They had one bad night, right, with a hookup, and typically it was like a casual encounter, and they freaked out because they never experienced an erection problem before and made an appointment with the sex therapist. And that's great to kind of really address the problem immediately, but there's no diagnosis there, right? We're all going to experience erectile difficulties from time to time. And what was a common theme among these guys is that they were all kind of late 20s, early 30s, and not really adapting or adjusting to new physical demands on their body, on their time, and their environment. I think they still expected their body to respond as if they were 17 or 18 years old. But now they're working full time, but they're still kind of living a college life. So a lot of times they had like 3 to 5 roommates in a house. They were still going out, like drinking till like 2 a.m. and trying to get back up to work for their 9 to 5 the next day, and going home with some, hooking up with somebody at like 2 a.m. and wondering why they can't get an erection. It's like, well, let's look at all the factors here that are working against you now, right? Not only like being 32 is a lot different than being 22. So your body is going to go through some changes as we age, and we have to adjust accordingly. There's some things that we can do to help it, but other things like we just have to adjust and like kind of lower expectations. The other things was the drinking and the lack of privacy from roommates, and mixed in there with some performance anxiety. And so helping these individuals with quote unquote ED, again, I put the quotes because it's not an actual diagnosis for them. It's to be expected that they have some difficulty. It's to reorganize their life a little bit, to be like, okay, if you want to have more of a reliable erection, so to speak, it's like maybe you need to cut yourself off after a couple of drinks. Maybe you need to call it a night before midnight, as opposed to like 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. when your body just wants to go to bed. So making some of these lifestyle kind of adjustments and realizing that, they're not a college student anymore, really allows their body to be more reliable and getting the sexual response that they want.
So you're saying that a pill doesn't solve everything?
It doesn't, but the pills are great. Like I recommend PDE5 inhibitors like Viagra all the time, because for these guys, especially who get like so scared from one instance of ED, that they're going to be more likely to experience it, because now they're freaking out. And the next sexual encounter is like, am I going to have this again? And that's just going to set them up to actually experience it again. So what the PDE5 inhibitors can be great as is kind of like short circuiting that kind of fear conditioning. And so more than likely these young guys taking a Viagra that will produce an erection, and that can build up some confidence in the short term, and then the behavioral changes can like make that lasting impact on their erectile functioning.
Right. I've had conversations with a few guy friends of mine about this, to where because I'm, like you said, everybody comes across at one point or another. I have before, and we brought up the topic of, was it the nervousness of having sex with somebody, or was it the sex itself wasn't the kind of sex that you enjoy, that you were trying to have? Like it wasn't in your style. It wasn't what you prefer, wasn't your kink, wasn't your fetish. Do you run into that occasionally when talking with folks?
We do, yeah. And I think that's oftentimes when porn gets blamed. And that's when people think that it's the what's called like porn-induced ED, right? And porn-induced erectile dysfunction. Again, that's not a clinical term. That's just kind of the layperson term that's floating out there. And there's no research to actually support that. There's a couple of case studies and a lot of anecdotes like on Reddit talking about it and blaming porn for their ED. But what's actually contributing to erectile difficulties is everything that we've just talked about. And what you just mentioned recently of maybe they're not getting the type of stimulation, whether physical stimulation, visual stimulation, the environmental stimulation necessary that would facilitate adequate arousal for them. And that's not blaming porn that, oh, you can only become aroused to the porn you watch. It's like, well, you're seeking out porn that is arousing to you. And if you, in real life, you're not seeking out that same kind of stimulation, then yeah, your body's going to be like, I'm not interested in this, right? So it's giving permission to be like, okay, what turns you on in porn that's not really happening in real life, right? And you can get into some like the myths if they're only attracted to like certain body parts that have to look a certain way or something like that. But in my clinical experience, and educational and research experience, that's not the case. The case is more of like a specific behavior or an act, whether that's like an actual fetish or a kink or something, or just a way to be touched. Because we're experts in our own body through masturbation, and our partner may not touch us that way. And so our body's not going to respond favorably. And so telling and teaching a partner how we like to be touched, and we learn all that through masturbation and porn, and that's actually a good thing to know about ourselves, and not to vilify and thinking like, no, porn's the problem, masturbation's the problem, you need to have sex and respond favorably in kind of like this vanilla way that society thinks that you should respond favorably to within the sexual encounter.
This one's kind of more on your how you came up professionally, being that you're an avid supporter of the Satanic Temple. So I was wondering, over the course of in the last, like say, 20 years, being able to run a practice, do these studies, work in a university, and do all this amazing work, but being very public with your beliefs, have you found those two worlds collide often, or to where it's like, this is what I am, I have no shame about it, I'm not going to hide it from people as far as my beliefs, what I do, what I support, or did you find that they're very just kind of linked in the work that you do to begin with?
Yeah, it's all of the above. I think becoming a little bit more comfortable in my authentic self and having that be expressed in all domains of my life, whether it's my personal life, my professional life, my online life, whatever that may be, that there is greater authenticity in all those areas. And that does include like my interest in satanic things and horror movies and heavy metal music. And that's part of who I am. That's just not like a passing interest. That's definitely rooted in who I am. And it's always been that case way back till childhood. This has always just kind of been almost an inherent interest of mine. And so being able to wear that on my sleeve a little bit more openly has been just more of an expression of my authentic self. And yeah, I mean, it has brought up, has run me into conflicts before and to problems, but I've always just viewed that as, I don't know, it's not necessary to experience that in an ideal world, but it's to be expected. I'm not naive enough to believe that those interests or those beliefs or even just the name like Satanist of what that brings up for people, like these images of like devil worshippers and, you know, human sacrifice and all that. Like, I'm not naive to think that this isn't provocative, and sometimes I weaponize that, and I think that's part of Satanism, is to be intentionally provocative and to weaponize it in a way, in certain avenues. And so I've always just kind of viewed any kind of conflicts I've gotten from that as just kind of what's to be expected. It's certainly a headache dealing with some of these battles, but I've never allowed it to kind of shape my behavior, whether it's getting pushback in my professional world or a little bit in my personal world. Over time, you just kind of making this full circle, what I was talking about earlier, of like helping clients overcome like religious sexual shame. It's like finding your new community, your new people, where you are surrounding yourself more with like-minded individuals, so there will be less conflict. So that just happens over time of like, yeah, I'm distancing myself in my personal life from people who would judge me for these things. Like, why do I need that in my personal life? In my professional life, I really lean into it a little bit more now. I'm tenured. I'm going to be up for a full professor promotion this year. So it's like I have more like professional power that I'm not worried about necessarily like getting fired. And so I'm kind of leaning into that position of power and authority a little bit more. And also with that, it's also providing an example for people like me, who may not have these positions of power or authority, or who are still in communities or families that are really stigmatizing against them or really trying to marginalize them, that I can be an example of somebody who has this kind of professional career in academia and be out about all of this. And that's why I've always said that, yeah, it's going to be off-putting to a lot of people. My classes are electives. Pretty much everything I do, no one's like forced to interact with me, right? It's all by choice. And so those who are selecting to be a part of my world, they are seeing something valuable here. And I want to model that as, I never want to be a sex educator for everyone. I want to be a sex educator for like the misfits and the perverts and the weirdos and the people like me growing up that could have really used a model, an older model, to say that it's okay to incorporate all these kind of unique things about you into your professional life as well.
Right. That's good words for me as a young life coach to hear as well. So I appreciate you not only being your authentic self, but saying like, yeah, it's okay to do that, because ultimately we're helping
Right.
people.
Mm-hmm.
It's does it matter what music I listen to, or if I'm helping you get down the path you need to get down? So, final question. This is a fun one, probably the most important question, Eric. What is the horror movie of choice for this spooky season?
Well, my favorite horror movie, and I put an asterisk next to this, is The Witch from 2015.
Yes.
Right. Blows me away every time I watch it. I probably watch it 5 or 6 times now. The asterisk is only because it's so new. So it's only like 6 years old, right? So if I'm looking like, is it going to hold up 20 years from now? I think it will, but it's just an amazing movie. It's my favorite kind of horror movie that kind of, it's a slow burn. It's atmospheric, much like The Shining or Rosemary's Baby. There's confusion of like, is mental illness going on, or is there something supernatural going on? That confusion, that murkiness, that line between mental illness and the supernatural world, is really like what I personally like in horror movies, and The Witch really captures that.
We want to thank Dr. Eric Sprankle once again for being our guest on today's episode. The work he's doing is extremely vital, very important. You can check out what he's been up to in the past and the present at drsprankle.com. My favorite thing about talking with Eric was what we talked about in regards to his work and his beliefs about being the most authentic self you can while doing what you love. That sounds like a life goal that everybody should have out there. Be authentic, do what you love, bring harm to none. Pet a dog, pet your cat. But again, thank you, Eric Sprankle, for being our guest on this episode of Hero and the Villain. We will definitely have more soon. Thank you for listening. Remember to hit subscribe, follow on Spotify, Google, all that jazz. Find us on Instagram, Hero Villain Podcast. Follow us there, and we will see you on the next episode.